of totalitarianism descended across much of the globe, in the mid-20th century, the Western intellectual class pointed to George Orwell's 1984 as a blueprint for societal ruin. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Orwell's magnum opus, but for those who don't know the gist, Orwell envisioned a dystopian future governed by a panoptic state, where an externally imposed oppression would ruthlessly strip humanity of its autonomy, its history, and its capacity for critical thought. It is a great novel, and many believe it was prophetic. I certainly believe parts of it ring true. But as the cultural critic Neil Postman astutely observed in his foreword to Amusing Ourselves to Death, it was not Orwell but Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, who accurately mapped the specific destiny of the modern collapse. Huxley recognized a far more insidious threat. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book because there would be no one who wanted to read one. No big brother is required to deprive a populace of its cognitive liberty. He foresaw a society that would come to adore the very technologies that undid its capacity to think. Where Orwell feared those who would ban books, Huxley feared there would eventually be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one left who wanted to read one. Where Orwell feared the truth would be actively concealed, Huxley feared it would be drowned in an endless sea of irrelevance. Ultimately, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us, while Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. If we want to contemplate the magnitude of what is currently being lost, we must first recognize the scale of what was built. The entire trajectory of modernity is inextricably bound to the technological intervention of the printing press. Before Johannes Gutenberg's invention in the mid-15th century, knowledge was preserved through painstaking and highly precarious scribal efforts. Manuscripts, no matter how valuable, were perpetually subjected to the inevitable corruptions of copyists, the ideological whims of local elites, and the physical threats of moisture, vermin, theft, and time. Under such volatile conditions, the primary intellectual energy of scholars was devoted merely to the preservation of existing texts, leaving little bandwidth for the creation of new paradigms. The printing press was, as the historian Elizabeth Eisenstein articulated, a revolutionary agent of change that fundamentally altered the fabric of human cognition and social organization. Eisenstein demonstrated that print democratized knowledge, but far more importantly, it stabilized it. By ensuring that identical standardized copies of a text could be distributed across vast geographic distances, the printing press created a unified commonwealth of learning. This allowed scholars spread across Europe to cross-reference data, detect contradictions, and build upon a fixed, reliable corpus of knowledge. As the historian David Wootton argues in The Invention of Science, the codification of the fact, the establishment of the scientific method, and the formulation of the empirical laws of nature were made possible entirely by this typographic stability. Without the printing press, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment would have been impossible, as the accurate recording of experiments and the widespread dissemination of hypotheses required an exactitude that oral and scribal cultures simply could not provide. Furthermore, the explosion of literacy in the 17th and 18th centuries both spread new ideas and changed how humans think. In the Gutenberg Galaxy, Marshall McLuhan argued that the shift from an oral society to a print-based society birthed the typographic man, creating a paradigm of visual quantification and linear segmentation. The written word forced the human mind to process information sequentially, logically, and objectively. This cognitive restructuring laid the psychological groundwork for modern individualism, the rationalism of Protestantism, the structural complexities of capitalism, and the organization of the nation-state. The printing press therefore became the very scaffold of modern thought itself. Reading is not a natural human instinct, while spoken language is an innate biological capacity that develops spontaneously in children. Reading is a learned neurological artifact, a highly artificial technology that must be painstakingly installed into the brain circuitry over years of disciplined practice. The philosopher Walter Ong, in his work Orality and Literacy, mapped the vast cognitive chasm between oral and literate cultures. In primary oral cultures, thought is tied directly to immediate situational and operational frames of reference. It is communal, highly emotional, and dependent on associative memory. Because oral cultures lack text to store knowledge, they must use heavy stylistic formulas epithets, rhythmic repetition, and dramatic storytelling to prevent their cultural heritage from vanishing into the ether. The introduction of literacy, and especially ubiquitous print literacy, freed the human mind from the restrictive burden of memorization, allowing cognitive resources to be entirely reallocated toward abstract, analytical, and critical thought. Ong noted that literate cultures develop increasingly complex syntax using subordinating conjunctions like because, therefore, whenever, and although to construct intricate, multi-tiered logical arguments. A literate mind is uniquely trained to follow a linear chain of reasoning across hundreds of pages, to hold contradictory ideas in tension, to evaluate empirical evidence dispassionately, and to separate the emotional resonance of a speaker from the objective validity of their argument. This deep reading circuit cultivates cognitive patience and expands the capacity for empathy through prolonged immersion in the interior lives of others. The typographic mind, therefore, is the engine of complex modernity. It is a mind capable of sustaining attention over long durations, navigating moral ambiguity, and operating within the highly abstract frameworks required for advanced scientific inquiry, complex jurisprudence, and the delayed gratification of democratic deliberation. As Ong observed, literate cultures view knowledge as static, analytical, and open to individual reflection, a contrast to the performative and participatory nature of oral knowledge. This cognitive ability, which was built over centuries, is currently undergoing a devastating demolition. The advent of the internet initiated this shift, but the true historical turning point was the proliferation of the smartphone and short-form algorithmic media in the mid-2000s. We have entered an era of secondary orality, as Ong presciently termed early electronic media, but amplified to an unprecedented and terrifying degree by algorithms explicitly designed to exploit human neurochemistry. Social media platforms have fully integrated text, images, and video, creating a fluid and highly participatory communication environment that deliberately mimics the emotional immediacy of primary oral cultures while discarding the analytical rigor of print. As the prominent neuroscientist Marianne Wolf observes, the plasticity of the human brain, the very evolutionary trait that allowed us to repurpose visual and language circuits to learn to read 6,000 years ago, now works aggressively against us in a digital environment. The brain relentlessly adapts to the medium through which it consumes information. When individuals process information quickly, in brief bursts and amidst constant notifications and interruptions, they actively curtail the development of the contemplative dimension of the brain. Digital interfaces demand a mode of reading that is actually skimming, a frantic, superficial scanning for keywords, dopamine hits, and bottom-line information. When the reading brain skims, it bypasses the deep neural pathways responsible for complex thought. It literally deprives itself of the milliseconds required to grasp syntactic complexity, to understand nuanced emotional states, or to perceive literary beauty. This is a fundamental rewiring of the cerebral cortex. The iPad has become the new pacifier for toddlers, and adults increasingly spend their days hunching over glowing screens, absorbing a flotilla of fragmented news feeds and algorithmically curated emotional stimuli. We are witnessing the rise of a new mega machine, to borrow a concept from the social critic Lewis Mumford. Writing in the late 1960s in The Pentagon of Power, Mumford warned of a technocentric society governed by a new priesthood of technicians, where humans are treated as malfunctioning components to be repaired or data-generating nodes to be harvested. Today's digital ecosystem perfectly embodies Mumford's mega machine. It colonizes not just our economic systems, but the very interiority of the human psyche, conditioning passivity and severing individuals from the rich history of human thought. The symptoms of this cognitive counter-revolution are visible not only in the general populace, but at the very apex of the educational system, signaling a crisis that threatens the reproduction of the intellectual class itself. Over the past decade, professors at elite academic institutions have sounded the alarm regarding a precipitous and bewildering decline in student literacy. In a widely discussed exposition in The Atlantic, Nicholas Dames, a professor of Columbia University's required literature humanities course since 1998, noted that his undergraduate students, the supposed academic elite of the nation, are now bewildered by the thought of finishing multiple books a semester. 2 decades ago, Dames's classes effortlessly engaged in sophisticated week-to-week analyses of lengthy texts like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Today, the landscape is unrecognizable. In 2022, a first-year student confessed to Dames that during her entire tenure at a public high school, she had never been required to read a single book cover to cover. Instead, her education consisted of excerpts, isolated poems, and fragmented news articles. This is a systemic failure. Middle and high schools have largely ceased assigning whole books, breaking them down into easily digestible, context-free fragments to accommodate dwindling attention spans. High-achieving students can still decode words, but they struggle to muster the sustained attention or cognitive ambition required to immerse themselves in substantial texts. As technology provides instant gratification, the sustained labour of reading feels deeply unnatural to a generation raised on screens. This anecdotal evidence from the highest echelons of the academy is overwhelmingly corroborated by a mountain of empirical data. The decline in sustained reading and linguistic proficiency is measurable and accelerating. Reading for pleasure in the United States has suffered a sustained decline of approximately 3% per year over the last 2 decades, resulting in a 40% overall drop. In 2025, fewer than 1 in 5 adolescents, 18.7% in the UK, reported reading daily in their free time, marking a nearly 20 percentage point drop since 2005. Standardized testing reflects this collapse. The 2024 Nations Report Card, NAEP, revealed that 40% of American fourth graders are now working below basic reading proficiency levels, meaning they cannot recognize a text's central premise or make simple inferences. Reading scores for 13-year-olds dropped 7 points compared to a decade ago. Perhaps most alarming for the future of complex thought is the corresponding collapse in vocabulary. Longitudinal studies indicate that American adults' vocabulary, a critical indicator of verbal ability and conceptual thought, declined significantly between the 1970s and the 2010s. Even among college graduates, vocabulary scores have dropped by more than half a standard deviation. High school teachers increasingly report that students cannot comprehend exam questions because they lack basic scholarly vocabulary, routinely failing to understand standard academic terms. When the linguistic reservoir shrinks, the capacity for complex thought shrinks commensurately. As human beings possess fewer words to describe their reality, their internal landscape becomes less capable of holding contradiction and vastly more susceptible to crude emotional manipulation. For most of the 20th century, humanity experienced the Flynn effect, a steady generation-over-generation increase in fluid intelligence and IQ scores, largely attributed to better nutrition, mass education, and the increasing cognitive demands of a complexifying society. However, recent extensive data sets indicate that the Flynn effect has not only plateaued, but has actively reversed in numerous developed nations. Studies analysing hundreds of thousands of test takers, such as a major Norwegian longitudinal study, demonstrate that men born in 1991 score significantly lower on mandatory military IQ tests than those born in 1975 or 1962. Of course, there are more controversial demographic reasons for this too. This decline is particularly pronounced in fluid intelligence among lower ability groups and occurs across different generations within the very same families, pointing definitively to environmental rather than genetic causes according to the study. Researchers hypothesize that changing media exposure, worsening educational standards, and the loss of deep reading are the primary drivers of this cognitive regression. We are witnessing a population that is, measurably and statistically, losing its capacity for abstract reasoning. This cognitive stagnation perfectly mirrors a broader cultural and scientific exhaustion. In his incisive book, The Decadent Society, Ross Douthat diagnoses the contemporary West as suffering from decadence, defined not by moral hyperindulgence, but by economic stagnation, institutional decay, and cultural and intellectual exhaustion at a high level of material prosperity and technological development. In a decadent society, repetition becomes the norm over innovation. Intellectual life goes in circles, public institutions succumb to sclerosis, and cultural output is utterly dominated by sequels, nostalgia, and formulaic entertainment. Douthat contrasts the monumental achievement of the Apollo moon landing in 1969 with the triviality of the digital age, echoing Peter Thiel's famous lament, "They promised us flying cars and all we got was 140 characters." The intellectual infrastructure has grown entirely sclerotic. Even in the hard sciences, the pace of genuine breakthrough is faltering. Research by Patrick Collison and Michael Nielsen reveals a measurable decline in the perceived magnitude and frequency of Nobel-level scientific discoveries. While the raw volume of published academic papers has exploded, the deeply original, paradigm-shifting breakthroughs that characterize the late 19th and early 20th centuries have grown exceedingly rare. It is highly probable that the hyper-fragmentation of the modern digital mind precludes the sustained concentration required to generate truly revolutionary scientific paradigms. We are living off the accumulated intellectual capital of a bygone typographic era, mistakenly equating the iterative development of consumer software and social media algorithms with genuine scientific and civilizational advancement. Modern liberal democracy is, at its absolute core, a product of print culture. As the philosopher Jürgen Habermas elucidated in his foundational work, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, the democratic ideal relies on the existence of a bourgeois public sphere, a space originally fostered by literary journals, reading clubs, and print media, where rational subjects could engage in critical discourse. This sphere assumes a citizenry capable of separating reason from emotion, capable of following a prolonged argument, and capable of internalizing the heavy cognitive duties of civic literacy to act as a counterweight to state authority. Habermas prophetically warned that if the public sphere became colonized by the market and public relations, rational individuals would be transformed into passive consumers of manipulated public opinion. To understand how far we have fallen from the typographic democratic ideal, one need only contrast the political discourse of the 19th century with that of the present day. In the late summer and fall of 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas engaged in a series of 7 senatorial debates across Illinois. The format of these debates was staggering by modern standards. One candidate would speak for 60 minutes uninterrupted, the other would reply for 90 minutes, and the first would then deliver a 30-minute rebuttal. Tens of thousands of ordinary citizens, farmers, tradesmen, and labourers without formal university education stood outdoors for 3 hours at a time, closely following legally complex and philosophical arguments concerning the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, popular sovereignty, and the moral status of slavery. These citizens, shaped by a culture of the printed word, possess the cognitive stamina and auditory attention span required to process such monumental rhetoric. Today, such an event is biologically and culturally inconceivable. The modern presidential debate has been reduced to a circus of 60-second answers and 30-second sound bites, engineered for the generation of viral moments tailored for social media algorithms. The medium of the screen absolutely demands spectacle, conflict, and aesthetic performance over substance. As the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt argues in his analysis of why the past decade of American life has been uniquely stupid, social media has acted as a modern Tower of Babel. It has fractured shared narratives, destroyed institutional trust, and fundamentally shifted human interaction away from connection and toward performative outrage and tribal division. An electorate that has lost the capacity to read a book cannot possibly be expected to evaluate the nuances of macroeconomic policy or geopolitical strategy. What we are experiencing, therefore, is not an evolution but a dark regression to a pre-Enlightenment mode of cognition, stripped of the organic, community-binding mechanisms of ancient oral traditions. In a post-literate, screen-dominated society, logic is usurped by aesthetics and argument is replaced entirely by image. In 1967, the Marxist theorist Guy Debord warned of this exact trajectory in the Society of the Spectacle, arguing that modern life was rapidly dissolving into an endless stream of appearances, where everything that was directly lived has receded into a representation. Debord understood that the spectacle is a fundamental social relationship mediated by images. It is a mechanism of social control that transforms authentic social interactions into passive observation, conditioning a state of continuous passivity where individuals spectate rather than participate in their own lived reality. In the digital age, Debord's spectacle has achieved total and terrifying hegemony. As many of us know, the algorithm does not reward truth, it rewards engagement, and the most potent, reliable driver of human engagement is emotional reactivity. As the written word loses its primacy, the structural forces of politics shift away from the rational persuasion of the individual citizen and toward the manipulation of the mass mind through myth, symbol, and viral aesthetic. This shift inadvertently fulfills the political theology of the authoritarian jurist Carl Schmitt. A fierce critic of liberal parliamentarianism, Schmitt believed that the modern liberal reliance on rational deliberation and procedural legality was a weak, decadent facade. Schmitt argued that true political power in mass societies is not rational, but representational and mythic, driven by the existential distinction between friend and enemy, and the aestheticization of mass identity. When a society loses its typographic scaffolding, it naturally reverts to these Schmittian dynamics. The political sphere ceases to be a forum for rational debate and becomes a gladiatorial arena for the clash of competing myths and tribal loyalties. Digital platforms perfectly exacerbate this by trapping users in algorithmic echo chambers where they are fed an endless stream of context-free videos, memes, and slogans that bypass the critical faculties entirely and inject fear, anger, or tribal euphoria directly into the limbic system. We are witnessing the death of the rational actor and the rebirth of the tribal mind, now armed with the destructive capabilities of 21st century technology. We are living through the breaking of a long, golden chain of knowledge, the unbroken lineage of minds that could sit in total silence, wrestle with a difficult text, hold competing philosophies in their head, and engage in the solitary act of sustained reasoning is fracturing before our eyes. In its place, we are ushering in something unknown, a society technologically advanced but intellectually infantile, possessing the world-altering power of gods but the attention span of gnats. The transition from the printed page to the glowing screen is basically complete, and the consequences are now irreversibly embedded in our neurochemistry, our politics, and our culture. The typographic era, which birthed reason, science, and democracy, was an anomaly. We are returning to the dark, to the tribal, to the visceral, a society that has happily and inevitably forgotten how to think. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave it a like and subscribe. And if you would like to support me further, the best way to do it is through either Buy Me a Coffee or Substack. Both are linked down below.